Jelle, the stage is yours.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, for those who don't know me, I'm Jelle Millenaar. I work at the IOTA Foundation as the lead identity, which means I oversee the development of our IOTA identity framework, but also make sure that I interact with both the community and our partners on the topic of digital identity. So what I would like to do today is kind of give a brief introduction to what is the IOTA identity framework in the sense of why are we building something like this and what is it meant to do. I would like to show some links for inspiration on how you can use identity. Uh, Briefly show the wiki again, which I think you
Sure.
just got a nice intro to, but maybe more specific for identity. And lastly, um, yeah, show some of the examples and how you could get started with using the IOTA identity framework and using the online resolver tool also to your own advantage. So that's a packed agenda, I hope, but let's see how far we come and where the interest lies. I'm perfectly happy to respond to questions during like whenever I'm talking. So feel free to basically unmute yourself and ask any questions if you have any. But other than that, let's get started. So IOTA Identity is a framework for secure digital identities for individuals, organizations, and devices. You could even add objects to this list. I define objects slightly different than devices, where objects don't really have an electronic circuit board of their own. They're just like a static object. But they are always a little bit more tricky um, for IOTA identity in itself. So why did we start with the IOTA Identity project? Well, it was really to try and solve the big problem that we have on the internet, and that is the trust problem. It's currently very hard to trust anything that is being said online by anyone because you don't know who they are, and any claims that they make is basically not verifiable. When the internet was young, I think it was very common for people to not share anything about their real world identities. No name, no address, not anything. Um, Nowadays, we do that differently with social media. We share most of our lives. We share our name, our address, pictures of what we're doing, where we work, etc. And this should be a useful digital identity, you would say. The problem is that these identities are not verifiable on their own. So you can't verify that things being said online are actually true. So, for example, while LinkedIn is a very useful website and most people hopefully speak truth there, I wouldn't trust it as a CV on its own. I would still try and call employers or something like that to validate that things are correct. And this is still a trust problem that we have online. Nothing can be verified. So this is something that we try to fix. But even then, our data for our own digital identities is being monopolized. The big tech companies, Facebook, Google, and the sort, and yeah, they have a reasonably accurate estimation of who you are online due to all the data scraping that they have. And this is definitely something we want to move away from on the next generation of the internet. At the same time, we see new privacy laws being developed all across the world, often inspired by the European GDPR. And this actually makes it very hard for companies to store your information in a way that they don't get penalized by the law or like have to pay fines for doing things incorrectly, such as a hack happening or something like that. So the recent movement that is happening is that companies really want to use data in order to know their customers, yet they don't want to store it. And this is where kind of the idea of a bring your own identity could come in, where you could, basically bring your own data to a company in order to for them to give the best services to you that fit you, but at the same time they don't have to store it. That is basically the direction we would like to go. And lastly, to go in the direction of the devices, there are a lot of IoT devices already in the world deployed. Um, and what we see is that these devices are being read out and used by the companies that deploy them. However, there's not a lot of cross silo activity going on. Devices from other companies are not trusted, and therefore we really don't utilize IoT to the extent that we could. So if IoT devices themselves could also be trusted more, and the security of these IoT devices can also be increased, the whole idea of IoT actually might start to come more to fruition. So how do we want to do that with IOTA identity, or kind of the digital identity concept in general, is to give all of the different actors their own digital identities that are verifiable, um, and in the control of these entities themselves. So for people, it means I can create my own digital identity and I can control it, and I can control my own data and decide who to share it with. That's a nice concept, but why would that replace something like a Google or a Facebook in terms of all the data scraping that they did, right? Because they probably have a really accurate profile. So why would I ask my customer if I can just buy the data from Google? Well, we can be more accurate about ourselves. We have more data about ourselves, or at least we could start to collect more data about ourselves. Some things that Google and Facebook are never able to be certain about. Um, and most importantly, we can make sure that our data is verifiable by making sure that it is digitally signed. And that is a concept that I'll dive into in a little bit. So for organizations, this is also really important to have their own identities, so that when you interact with an organization, you can identify them, which basically throws out all the fraud problems that we have in today's world. But also between organizations for invoicing and stuff like that, it's also very important to correctly identify who is invoicing you or who are you invoicing. So for organizations, an identity is also really important. And then lastly, the devices, as I just explained. If IoT devices could identify themselves by proving who have manufactured them, who has installed the software, who has installed the device on the location, perhaps even who has benchmarked the accuracy of their data. And if I can prove all that as an IoT device, then my data is suddenly much more trustworthy, much more valuable. And that is something that probably will kind of really kickstart the real adoption of IoT, where not just a company installs their own IoT devices, but it becomes an open lake of data that anyone can access and can start to trust. And there's value in that, right? So this is where a concept of a data marketplace might come in, where these devices can actually sell their data because it's actually worth something at that point. And this is also probably more interesting for this particular hackathon, as IoT devices are, of course, perfect ways to measure the quality, or the um, the place where it comes from, track where it comes from and where it goes through, from agricultural products or machines or anything that is being used in the industry. So yeah, this is definitely an interesting part to highlight. So with IOTA Identity, we really try to make things as easy as possible for you guys, for the developers that want to utilize this framework. We don't want to differentiate between the identities of people, organization, and things, because what happens then is that interaction between these parties becomes more difficult. So we have basically one framework, but any application can be built on it for the different directions that you might want to go. Um, of course, with IOTA being feeless and still public permissionless, it means that you don't have to worry about having to get IOTA tokens. No, I would actually encourage that if you in this hackathon build anything on IOTA, use the mainnet immediately, because It is free to do so, and you don't have to migrate from one network to the other. And there are, of course, public nodes accessible for you to utilize. So if you do that, it always feels more special that you're already building on the main net. And on IOTA, it is just that easy. You don't need tokens, you don't need fees. So that ease of use is also further reflected in our framework. So I guess the most important part is here to understand how IOTA identity works, or digital identity in general, because we are adopting standards from the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, which are the DID standard and the verifiable credential standard. And what you have to consider is that identities are basically a collection of public keys and kind of metadata. This can be, we call them service endpoints or services, and they're basically URLs to more information about an identity. So for an organization, it could be their website. It could also be an email address where you can contact them. For a person, we generally speaking don't recommend putting too much data in for privacy laws, right? We have to consider GDPR. But for devices, they can actually contain a lot more information, such as links to specifications of the IoT device, proofs indeed of who manufactured them, etc. So this is basically their online profile that is publicly accessible, and that is embedded in the tangle that you see here at the bottom. And besides this metadata, I mentioned the importance, or the fact that there are public keys. And this is really important for that verifiable data that I keep talking about. So for verifiable data, we always have three parties that are important to identify: the issuer, the holder, and the verifier. The holder is basically the subject of this interaction. They are owning their own data, and they want to prove something about themselves. So I always take a very easy example. Let's say I want to prove that I have a bachelor degree. So what I would want is a signed statement from my university. So my university then acts as an issuer, a trusted third party, and they sign a verifiable credential, which is basically a JSON formatted claim about who I am, about the fact that I have a bachelor degree. They put in all my information that is specific to me and sign it using one of the public keys that is embedded on the tangle. Then they give me this copy to control myself. So now I have what we call the verifiable credential, and it contains my data plus a signature from my university that this is a valid bachelor degree. And now it's up to me to decide, who do I share this with? I can keep it for myself, of course, but if I want to ever share it for whatever reason, I can present this verifiable credential to anyone, and they become a verifier. So a verifier simply takes the data and checks against the tangle for the public key of the issuer in order to verify the signature, and therefore they can see, all right, this data is backed by someone, a trusted third party. So if they recognize the third party, the issuer, and they see, okay, this is actually a university that I recognize, then they will know that this bachelor degree is legit, and all the information in the document is unaltered and legit. So that could hold not just what bachelor degree I have, but it can contain the courses that I took, the grades that I have gotten, anything that you can think of. As long as it fits in a JSON file, it fits in a verifiable credential. And that's basically the main essence of how you would want to use identity for any of your applications. Quickly gonna skip over these. So the benefits of IOTA identity for example, the individual is like you can prove who you are in an online setting. You own your data. You control who you share it with. And it also makes it very convenient to share that data and, for example, sign up to new services that you would like to have. So, for example, if I would sign up for Amazon, I already may have a verifiable credential that I'm above 18, so I can order alcohol. I have a credential where I live, so they know where to send it to. And I don't even need to create an account at that point anymore because I can just present this information as they need it. For organizations, there are also many advantages, such as more security in that they know who they are dealing with, for example, invoicing. It saves a lot of time and money in order to no longer have to manually verify physical documents from customers. It also optimizes their own business models. So let's go through some examples of how this can be used or is being used. So one of the examples that we created was the first self demo, a health passport. You can find that on self.iota.org. And this demo basically shows the probably well-known COVID passport that many countries have adopted nowadays. We already built this in April of 2020, like at the start of the COVID, the first COVID scare, I guess. And what we try to do is build this health passport with the best privacy and security that you could think of, because we saw this coming and we thought, well, if this needs to happen, we might as well make sure that it is done with a very privacy friendly and secure solution. So what you're able to do is basically get a verifiable credential proving that you have either been tested by a doctor or by a testing facility, or that you've been vaccinated. And you can then keep this credential in your own mobile wallet. And you can just present this anywhere in the form of a QR code, very similar to the experience that you have with the current days vaccination passports. The slight difference is, for example, that the QR codes are regenerated every time that you use it. So simply making a copy of a QR code, of course, should not be a valid passport, which unfortunately is the case for many implementations of current government apps. But you can actually go through this demo yourself. So if you visit self.iota.org, you will find 3 different demos, and you download an app, and it basically shows you how it would work using IOTA Identity. And if you're thinking about using IOTA Identity for this hackathon, I definitely encourage to do these demos, because they only take probably like 5 minutes to quickly run through. And it really shows, oh, this is how IOTA Identity would work in the real world in different scenarios. So this is one of the 3 scenarios. Another way that it can be used is for decentralized login system. So instead of login with Facebook, login with Google, there could be a login with IOTA, and that login system would work in a very similar experience, but would no longer have someone like Google or Facebook listen in. This is probably a very important one for today or for this weekend. One of the projects that we have at the IOTA Foundation is Trademark East Africa, where basically goods are tracked all the way from East Africa towards Europe, and in every stage, these products have kind of a digital passport where they can have their own identity with their own verifiable credentials to prove that they are allowed to go through customs, and they prove the origin, and you can attach IoT data to this and things like that. So this is a very good example of how identity isn't only for humans or like our problem on the internet, but it's also actually solving the supply chain issues that we have in current days. So it solves basically multiple problems, one being all of the physical papers that need to be printed out, hand copied, and stuff like that, and also increasing the trust in that data, and really have a collection of everything that happened through to one of those products throughout its lifetime. And you can also find more information about it in a link here. I'll make sure that I link these slides right after today's session. KYC services, so know your customer. This is also something that we now have a demo for on self.iota.org. I will not dwell on it right now, but basically, when you sign up to a new service, financial service, very often, you have to really prove who you are. And this process can take a week and requires a lot of your personal information. And we've shown in our demo that this can now take merely seconds with a single click of a button, where all of this information can be delivered in a digital format by you and immediately verified by the bank. And you can immediately sign up for new services. Vehicle identities is another awesome use case for this. Vehicles can prove, again, who they are, where they've been manufactured, but also their IoT data can be connected to a vehicle to show, like, hey, yeah, I'm a legit sensor from a Tesla, and I've registered that there's a pothole in the road here. Maybe the local government wants to have access to that data so that they can fix it, or it can detect trash alongside the road. Because let's be honest, the newer generation of cars are basically driving sensors that are super valuable to use for many different use cases. And yeah, like maybe as a last general thought is that we really see IOTA identity taking place for really connecting people with the infrastructure in a way of trust. So I can bring my own digital identity and I can interact with everything around me in a very smooth manner. Because it doesn't matter if I'm interacting with a person and I want to prove that I have a bachelor degree, or if I interact with a little gateway to prove that I have a paid ticket for using public transportation, such as a train, or if I want to interact with a car that I want to hire in order to drive around in it, that I can prove that I have a driver's license and I'm insured. All of these interactions are basically exchanges of trust, exchanges of information. And that is what IOTA Identity wants to create. Create a world where these interactions are very easy to do, no matter who you're talking to. So that's it for basically the intro presentation. Maybe I want to give it a second for any questions so far. All right, no unmutes. So I want to double check if you can still see my screen, that it doesn't
Yeah,
change
it's
now.
visible.
Yeah, okay, so you now see the Self website.
Yep.
Awesome. All right, so I already mentioned self.iota.org. You can see the URL, of course, in the top left. This is a website that explains our self demos. And in the top right here, you can click try the demo, and it brings you to these 3 different demos that you can go through yourself. So if I want to check out the KYC example, I click here and I basically go through a little bit of a story in order to set up a company, get a bank account, and get a liability insurance, all in the span of a couple of minutes. So when I do that, it brings me through the story. It will basically prompt you to download an app, etc. Again, really good for inspiration if you want to really experience how IOTA identity works. If you're already past that and you want to say, all right, I actually want to code with it, I recommend, of course, to go to our wiki, as has probably just been explained. So in the top section, you will find an identity section that has already quite a lot of different pages for you to explore. So in the introduction, you will see a quick overview of what is in there. The decentralized identity section has a nice walkthrough of these 3 types of identities and what they can do, and a little bit of the why you would want to use IOTA as well. And it also has this other video of a talk that I did, but I'll be honest, that probably overlaps quite a bit with everything I just said. So maybe for your own time, I would skip that. In the getting started section, there's good explanations of how to use and get started with the framework. So currently our framework is built in Rust, and Rust has the most features. So if you are capable of developing in Rust, I highly recommend using the Rust framework. However, we have provided bindings to WASM, which basically allows you to develop in JavaScript. It has a little bit less features right now. We're working on putting that on par, but nothing that will be released this weekend. But yeah, it already allows you to do all of the important basic stuff in identity. So creating identities, creating verifiable credentials, validating those, etc. The advantage of Rust is that we basically introduced an easier to use API, and it also uses the Stronghold project in order to secure your private keys. This is basically an out of the box security mechanism that would be very important for a real world application, but maybe less so for a demo on a hackathon. So yeah, you can choose the language that you want, and after doing that, it will give you a little bit of a getting started on how you install the library, how you build it, how you can set it up also in a web environment in the case of WASM. It has a nice API reference, of course, that has to be there. So you can actually look at all the functionalities that are in there. And what I find most important that we've put in a lot of time is to provide accurate examples. So if whatever you want to do with the framework, we've tried to make sure that there is a good example for you to look at, and that you can also directly run. So creating an identity, manipulating an identity, resolving an identity, creating verifiable credentials, revoking them, which basically means the issuer decides this statement that I've given is no longer valid. And at that point forward, it also is, you can't, it doesn't pass the verification check anymore. And yeah, even how to get it running on a private tangle and stuff like that is in here. So that those examples are there for both Rust and JavaScript, and you should be able to run them quite easily using simple command line commands. Other things that are in this wiki page is more of an introduction on the details, because I talked about DIDs, the decentralized identifiers, and I talked about these DID documents that contain public keys and services. But this explains these standards in a little bit more detail. It also goes through these steps of things that you want to do, these examples, and gives a little bit more background information. And for this particular page, we even have a runnable example embedded, but unfortunately, we only have this on the one page. But explains, more details around how it works. Lastly, the thing that I want to mention is that we also have a specification section that explains, for example, how IOTA implements identity, how exactly it runs on the Tangle, and also the DITCOM specification. So this isn't implemented, so you can't use it today, but DITCOM basically expresses how two identities can interact with each other in a standardized format. So if two identities want to validate that they both control their own identities, you would do an authentication. So if I click here on the authentication protocol, it would describe how this interaction looks like, and it has a full description of how these messages should look like according to a standard. Well, I don't expect anyone to implement a full standard during a hackathon, because unfortunately we haven't done that ourselves either. You could, of course, take the inspiration of how this could work and maybe implement a simplified version for your own use cases, because this specification is full of recommendations on why we are taking steps the way we are, and how to implement them. So if you're going to do something like a DID authentication or presenting credentials or issuing credentials, etc., I would recommend having a look at these DITCOM specifications. At the same time, we're also still looking for feedback. So if you have any feedback, you can click here in this link and provide the feedback. All right. Then my very last point of what I would like to show today, and that is the identity resolver. So the identity resolver is a recent tool that we've developed for people that are developing with IOTA identity. And basically you can find it on our Explorer. So explorer.iota.org. Then you have this tools section on the top right, and you can click here for the identity resolver. And what is cool about the identity resolver is that if you have created an identity, you can actually look it up here. You can type it in and you can view how it is found on the Tangle. So I just clicked this DID example button and it fills in an example DID and you can see it resolving now. It was quicker just 1 second ago. This time it is not as quick, but there we go. And it shows you what the current state is of the JSON document on the Tangle. You can also load its entire history, so you can actually see how an identity has changed over time. And you can even compare two versions and see exactly what has changed. So this is pretty useful when you are developing and you want to see, all right, my intent was to update an identity to have a new public key or some additional metadata. Did that go correctly? Then you can check it using this tool directly. So maybe to quickly showcase how that could work for you if you want to use this tool, I'm going to go back to the wiki. And here on the create and publish section, we have this embedded example that actually can execute this code directly in the browser. So if I click this play button, it has now created an identity and is already publishing it to the mainnet. And there you go. We already have created an identity and published it to the main network. That is how fast it is. And what is cool is that we directly provide this link to this identity resolver tool, and you can see here that there is an identity which is created on the 5th of November at 10:04, which is the time right now according to the GMT time. And of course, if you look at the history, you can also see another timestamp and everything that has happened to this identity. So yeah, it's really easy to get started with IOTA identity. Have a look at the wiki, have a look at the code examples on our repo. And of course, it's also important to actually know where do I find the repository. That would be on, if you go to the IOTA Ledger GitHub repository, you will see that quite often we're in the top list, but not today. So if you type in identity, you will find identity RS or Rust, and you can see that it is the correct one due to the activity. And if you click on here, you will find our repository. So the current thing that you're looking at is the repo mostly from the Rust perspective. But if you then want to go to the JavaScript version, the WASM, you can click here on bindings WASM, and you immediately go to the WASM section of it. But all the links can be found on the wiki, of course, as well. And yeah, that is honestly all that I can give you today in order to get started with IOTA identity. Are there any questions, suggestions, feedback, anything? All right. I assume that you're then all stunned by what you've just heard.
Thank you so much for this session, Yeli. This was amazing.
Yeah, you're very welcome. As a last offer, I guess, to everyone that is partaking in the hackathon today, yeah, today during the next, let's say, 6 hours or so, feel free to just tag me if you have any questions around IOTA identity. This can be on this Discord, or you can find me on the IOTA Discord as well. But as long as you tag me, I would be able to find that. You can also DM me directly and ask your question there. And yeah, I'm very happy to help. But it would be nice if most of those questions would come today. I'm not sure if I will be available during the weekend.
That's amazing, Jelle. Thank